The Winter's Cry. The winter wind howled through the deserted streets, sending icy gusts spiraling through the alleyways of Blackwood, a small town nestled in the heart of the Midwest. Officer Thomas Blake guided his patrol car down the dimly lit roads, his breath fogging up the windshield as he adjusted the heater. The clock on his dashboard read 11:42 p.m. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to a bone-chilling 10 degrees, a night too cold for anything to survive unprotected. Thomas had been an officer for over a decade, and though Blackwood was a quiet town, he had learned to never ignore his gut. Tonight, a strange heaviness pressed against his chest. He exhaled slowly, scanning the empty streets, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with the ease of routine. Then he heard it. A sound so faint, so fragile, he almost mistook it for the wind. But something in it, a desperate, quivering pitch, sent an alarm bell ringing in his mind. A cry. Not an animal. Not a cat trapped in some garbage heap. A baby. His heart hammered as he reached for the radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Blake. Possible disturbance near Mason and 4th. I'm investigating. The words came out steady, but his pulse quickened. He parked his squad car, stepping out into the biting cold, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Snowflakes drifted lazily under the alley lights, covering the ground in a deceptive blanket of peace. But the sound was growing clearer now. A tiny, weak wail, almost lost in the whisper of the wind. Thomas followed the sound, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. His breath hitched as he approached a rusty dumpster tucked against a brick wall, the faint cries coming from within. His stomach twisted as he reached out, his gloved hands gripping the lid. With a deep breath, he lifted. Inside, nestled among torn plastic bags and damp cardboard, were 2 newborn babies, tiny, fragile, and trembling against the cold. Their faces were flushed a painful red, their limbs weak and unmoving except for the occasional desperate twitch. The thin, tattered blanket covering them was barely enough to fight the deadly frost clinging to the night air. "Dear God," Thomas whispered, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, time froze. 2 lives, abandoned, left to die. His instincts kicked in. He ripped off his heavy police jacket, wrapping it tightly around their frail bodies as he grabbed his radio with his free hand. "Dispatch, I need an ambulance immediately. 2 abandoned infants. They're alive, but they're freezing. I'm at Mason and 4th. I repeat, urgent medical assistance needed." His voice cracked with emotion, but there was no time to dwell on it. The first baby, the slightly larger of the 2, gripped his finger weakly, her tiny hand ice-cold against his skin. She let out a shuddering whimper as he held her close to his chest. The second was quieter, her breaths shallow, her tiny face unmoving. Thomas tightened his arms around them, cradling both babies against his body heat. "You're gonna be okay," he murmured, rocking slightly as the sirens began to wail in the distance, flashing lights illuminating the snow-covered alley. As he stared down at the 2 fragile miracles in his arms, names came unbidden to his mind. Hope, for the little fighter who clung to life with all her might. Faith, for the quiet one who had held on despite the odds. "Hold on, little ones," Thomas whispered, his own heartbeat thrumming in his ears. "I've got you." The ambulance screeched to a stop, doors flinging open as paramedics rushed toward him. One of them, a woman with kind brown eyes, quickly assessed the babies. "They're hypothermic, but they're alive. You got to them just in time." Just in time. The phrase hit Thomas like a hammer. If he had ignored the sound, if he had driven past that alley, believing the silence of the town meant nothing unusual, they would have died. He watched as the paramedics worked, placing the twins into heated blankets, checking vitals, and securing them for transport. The sense of relief that swept through him was unlike anything he'd ever felt before. "Are you coming with us, officer?" the paramedic asked. Thomas hesitated. He had done his job, found them, called for help. But something inside him refused to let go. "Yes," he said, following them into the ambulance. I'm not leaving them. The silent choice. The rhythmic beeping of heart monitors echoed through the dimly lit hospital room, a mechanical lullaby marking the fragile rhythm of life. The neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, smelled of antiseptic and warmed air, the scent of sterility battling the fragile hope hanging in the air. Thomas Blake stood by the viewing window, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his uniform, staring through the glass at the two tiny infants fighting for survival. They were wrapped in soft hospital blankets now, their fragile bodies monitored by wires and tubes. The heat lamps cast a golden glow over their tiny features, making them look even smaller, more delicate. Despite everything, they were alive. And yet the thought that wouldn't leave Thomas's mind was, what happens next? A voice behind him broke through his daze. Officer Blake. He turned to see Dr. Ellen Brooks, the attending pediatrician. She was in her 50s, her graying hair pulled back into a neat bun, sharp eyes scanning the medical chart in her hands. Her tone was gentle, but her expression was serious. "They're stable for now," she said, offering a small smile. "We got them just in time. Another hour out there." And she trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. Thomas exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. "Thank God." The doctor nodded. "They're severely underweight, showing signs of malnourishment, but no other serious injuries. We're running tests, but so far, there are no underlying medical conditions. It seems like they were simply abandoned. No records, no mother in the system. No one has reported them missing." A familiar anger bubbled in Thomas's chest. He clenched his jaw, trying to push it down. "Who does that?" he muttered. "Who leaves two helpless babies in a dumpster?" Dr. Brooks sighed. "You'd be surprised." Before he could respond, a woman in a navy blazer and pearl necklace approached them, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She carried a folder tucked under one arm and wore an expression of quiet authority. "Officer Blake." She extended a hand. "I'm Diane Lewis, Child Protective Services. I understand you were the one who found the infants." Thomas shook her hand firmly. "That's right. Any updates on their case?" Diane pursed her lips. "Given their condition and the fact that they were abandoned, we'll need to find a foster placement as soon as they're cleared medically. Babies this young typically get placed fast, but..." She hesitated. "But what?" Thomas prompted. Diane sighed, flipping open the folder. "The problem is keeping them together. Most families are willing to take one infant, but taking on twins, especially ones with medical needs, is a big ask." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. The thought of these girls, Hope and Faith, being separated made his stomach turn. He glanced back at the incubators, where the twins lay side by side, as if sensing each other's presence even in their sleep. "They belong together," he said before he even realized the words had left his mouth. Diane nodded. "I agree. But the reality is, finding a family who can take both of them will take time. And even then, there's no guarantee." Something inside Thomas shifted. He wasn't a man prone to impulse decisions. His life was built on structure, on order. His job was his life, and he had no illusions about the sacrifices he had made for it. No family, no long-term relationships, just him and the job. And yet, as he looked at those two tiny girls, two souls who had been left to die in the freezing cold, who had clung to life despite the odds, he felt something stir deep within him. A responsibility, a connection he couldn't explain. "Can I visit them?" he asked, surprising even himself. Diane blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "You want to visit them?" "Yes, regularly. Until they're placed." Dr. Brooks gave a small smile. "That can be arranged." Diane, however, watched him closely. "Officer Blake, I don't mean to overstep, but is there something you're considering?" Thomas hesitated. Was there? The rational part of his mind screamed no. This wasn't his responsibility. He was a cop, not a parent. He worked insane hours, saw things no child should ever be around. His job had cost him relationships, a chance at a normal life. And yet, as he looked at Hope and Faith, at the smallest fighters he had ever seen, he realized that maybe, for the first time in his life, the job wasn't enough anymore. He turned back to Diane. What if I wanted to foster them? Silence. Even Dr. Brooks looked surprised. Diane recovered quickly, though her expression softened. Officer Blake, fostering 2 infants is a serious commitment. You'd need to go through background checks, home evaluations, training. I'll do it, he interrupted. Thomas, Diane sighed. You live alone. Your work schedule is unpredictable. Are you really prepared for what this means? Thomas ran a hand down his face, exhaustion and determination warring inside him. He had no idea what this meant. No clue what raising 2 infants would look like. But what he did know was this. If he walked away from these girls, if he let them get lost in the system, he would regret it for the rest of his life. I don't know if I'm ready, he admitted, his voice rough. But I know I don't want them to end up with someone who sees them as an obligation. They deserve better than that. Diane studied him for a long moment. Finally, she sighed, closing the folder. I won't lie to you, Officer Blake. This won't be easy. But if you're serious, I can start the paperwork. Thomas felt his heartbeat thunder in his chest. He was doing this. He was really doing this. I'm serious. Dr. Brooks smiled. Looks like these 2 just found someone who won't let them go. Thomas turned back to the window, staring at the tiny faces that had already changed his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. Hope, Faith. They had no one in this world. And maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. A new beginning. 6 weeks later, the sound of a wailing baby jolted Thomas awake. His eyes snapped open, but for a moment, his mind struggled to catch up with reality. The room was dark, except for the faint blue glow of the baby monitor on the nightstand. Then it hit him. This was real. This wasn't a dream. He wasn't patrolling the city streets, chasing criminals, or answering emergency calls. He was in his own apartment, and he was a father now. Faith's cries grew more frantic. Thomas groaned, rubbing his face as he stumbled out of bed. The wooden floor was cold under his bare feet, but he ignored it, making his way toward the nursery. The room was small but warm, its once empty space now filled with life. The faint scent of baby powder and fresh laundry mixed with the lingering smell of the paint he'd applied last week. The walls, once blank and sterile, were now decorated with soft yellow and gray patterns. 2 identical cribs stood against the far wall, their tiny occupants stirring restlessly inside. Hope was still asleep, her little hands curled near her face, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. But Faith, oh Faith, was wide awake, her face scrunched in an expression of pure rage. Thomas sighed, lifting her gently. All right, kiddo, what's the emergency? He mumbled, cradling her against his chest. She was so small, her warmth sinking into his skin. It was still surreal to him. How much trust these 2 helpless beings had in him. That they needed him. Faith sniffled, her little fists grasping at his shirt. Thomas rocked her gently, walking in slow circles. This had become their routine. Hope was the quiet one, the observant one, the one who fell asleep easily. Faith, however, was a tiny storm. She refused to be ignored. You're trouble, aren't you? Thomas muttered, his voice husky with exhaustion. Faith gave a tiny hiccup, burying her face in his shirt, and just like that, she was asleep again. Thomas let out a slow breath, staring down at her peaceful expression. Yeah, he whispered, shaking his head. Definitely trouble. The adjustment period. For the past 6 weeks, Thomas had been living a new reality, one filled with sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and a crash course in parenting that no police academy could ever prepare him for. His once silent apartment now buzzed with life. The hum of the bottle warmer, the soft coos of the babies, the rustling of tiny blankets, the sound of his own exhausted laughter as he struggled to balance two infants on his own. His life as a police officer had trained him for danger, for chaos, for the unexpected. But this was harder than anything he'd ever faced. At work, he could rely on protocols, instincts, and years of experience. But here, there was no manual, no backup, just him. And yet, despite the exhaustion, despite the self-doubt, every time he looked at Hope's sleepy little smile or felt Faith's tiny fingers clutching his own, he knew he had made the right decision. Mrs. Grayson's visit. Open the door, Officer Blake. I know you're in there, probably drowning in dirty diapers. Thomas smirked as he opened the door, revealing Mrs. Evelyn Grayson, his next-door neighbor and self-appointed grandmother to the twins. She stood on the threshold, arms crossed, her sharp blue eyes scanning him from head to toe. "Oh dear," she muttered, stepping inside. "You look like you got run over by a truck." Thomas snorted. "Feels like it too." Mrs. Grayson had been a lifesaver these past few weeks. She was in her 70s, had raised 4 children of her own, and knew more about babies than any book ever could. She walked straight past him, peeking into the nursery where Hope and Faith were napping. "They're growing," she said softly, adjusting the blankets around them. "You're doing good, Thomas." His chest tightened at the words. "I don't know about that," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Most days, I feel like I'm barely keeping up." Mrs. Grayson turned, fixing him with a knowing look. "Welcome to parenthood." He huffed out a tired laugh. "Here." She reached into her large tote bag, pulling out a container of homemade soup and a stack of neatly folded baby clothes. Thomas blinked. "You didn't have to." "Hush," she scolded, wagging a finger at him. "You think I'm gonna let you starve?" "No, sir. And you need help, whether you admit it or not." Thomas sighed. He didn't have the energy to argue. "Thanks, Mrs. G," he muttered. She patted his cheek affectionately. "Anytime, kid." A father's fear. Later that night, after another chaotic feeding session and a failed attempt to get some sleep, Thomas sat in the nursery, watching the twins as they slept. His heart ached in a way he didn't fully understand. For years, his life had been simple: patrol the streets, make arrests, file reports, go home to an empty apartment. Repeat. But now he had everything to lose. Hope stirred, making a tiny noise, her little hand twitching in sleep. And Thomas felt it. The fear that he wasn't enough, that he wasn't doing this right. That one day, someone would come knocking, someone from Child Services, telling him he wasn't fit to be their father, that they had found a better home for Hope and Faith. The very thought sent panic clawing up his throat. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, rubbing a hand down his face. "This wasn't supposed to be my life," he whispered, staring at them. "I was never supposed to be a dad." And yet, here he was. And despite the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty, he couldn't imagine walking away. Not now. Not ever. A promise. Before he left the nursery, Thomas reached into the cribs, resting a hand on each tiny chest, feeling their steady heartbeats beneath his palm. "I don't know what the hell I'm doing," he whispered, "but I promise you this." His voice trembled. "No one is ever going to hurt you again." The word hung heavy in the air, a vow that sank deep into his bones. And as the twins slept peacefully, unaware of the man who had just rewritten his entire future for them, Thomas knew he had made the right choice, even if it terrified him. The unexpected call. 10 months later, the steady beeping of Thomas Blake's radio filled his patrol car as he drove down Blackwood's quiet streets. The familiar rhythm of his night shift felt different now, no longer the center of his world, but rather a job he balanced with something much bigger. Parenthood. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, and he glanced at the screen. Mrs. Grayson, A smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he reached for it. She had become his lifeline these past months, helping him navigate the stormy, beautiful mess that was raising twins. "Hey, Mrs. G," he answered, putting her on speaker. "How's everything?" "Well, Hope just spit peas all over my sweater, and Faith figured out how to open the pantry. So I'd say things are going great." Thomas chuckled. Sounds about right. He still couldn't believe how fast time had passed. It felt like yesterday that he had brought the girls home, terrified he would mess it up. Now they were crawling, laughing, babbling nonsense words, and turning his apartment into a baby-proofed war zone. And he loved every second of it. "You on your way back soon?" Mrs. Grayson asked. "Finishing my shift now. Should be home in an hour." "Good, because these two are winning." Thomas smiled as he imagined his daughters, Hope with her thoughtful gaze, Faith with her wild curiosity, both of them growing into their own personalities. Just as he was about to say goodbye, his police radio crackled to life. "Unit 3, you have an incoming call transferred from dispatch." Thomas frowned. "A call? From who?" The dispatcher hesitated. "It's a woman. She says she needs to speak with you about something. Urgent." His stomach clenched. "Patch it through," he said, turning down the road toward home. There was a short pause, then a soft click as the call transferred. For a moment, silence. Then a voice that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Officer Blake." It was soft, hesitant, but full of something heavy. "Yes, this is Blake," he said cautiously. "Who's this?" A pause. Then 3 words that sent his world tilting. "I'm their mother." A mother's truth. The next morning, Thomas sat across from Catherine Wells in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. She was in her late 30s, her hair dark and neatly tied back, her hands folded tightly on the table. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her face, though still composed, carried the weight of something deep, something painful. "You're really them?" Thomas asked, voice low. "Hope and Faith's mother." Catherine nodded, exhaling shakily. "Yes." Thomas leaned forward, gripping his coffee cup. "Why now? Why after all this time?" She swallowed, fingers tightening. "Because I finally had the courage to look for them." Thomas's jaw clenched. He had spent the last 10 months loving these girls, raising them, watching them grow. And now, the woman who had left them in a dumpster had the audacity to show up. "Courage," he repeated, his tone sharper than he intended. Catherine flinched but didn't look away. "I deserve that." "Damn right you do," he muttered. "Do you have any idea what you put them through? What could have happened?" Catherine closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking slightly. "I never wanted to abandon them," she whispered. Thomas scoffed. "Yeah, could have fooled me." She opened her eyes, and for the first time, he saw it. Guilt, pain, and something that didn't match the story he had told himself. "They weren't supposed to be left like that," she said, voice thick with emotion. "I was going to take them to a safe place, to a fire station, but I was being followed. I panicked. I left them there, thinking I'd come back. But I couldn't." Thomas's fingers tightened around the cup. "Followed? By who?" Catherine hesitated. Then she reached into her purse, pulling out a folded newspaper clipping. She placed it on the table without a word. Thomas unfolded it. His breath stopped. The headline read, "Senator Caldwell's Scandal. Secret Child Allegations Resurface." And beneath it, a photo of Catherine. You could have dropped a bomb in the cafe, and Thomas wouldn't have reacted. His eyes flickered up to her. "What is this?" Catherine took a deep breath. The truth. A powerful enemy. Over the next hour, Thomas listened as Catherine revealed the real story. She had been barely 19 when she had met Senator James Caldwell, a powerful politician with a perfect public image, and a very dark secret. "He wanted me to get rid of them," she said, her hands shaking as she reached for her coffee. "I refused. He sent people after me. I knew if I didn't run, if I didn't hide, I wouldn't live to see the next day. Thomas felt sick. Hope and faith weren't just abandoned. They were meant to be erased. The thought of it made his blood boil. Why now? He asked again, his voice tight with anger. Catherine swallowed. Because Caldwell's power is slipping. He's got people digging into his past. If they find out about the girls, if they find out they're alive. She didn't have to finish. Thomas understood. Hope and faith were in danger. A father's choice. That night, Thomas sat in the nursery, watching the girls sleep. His heart ached. He had spent months building a life with them, learning their personalities, making promises he swore he'd keep. Now, everything felt like it was on the edge of a knife. What if Caldwell came after them? What if he tried to take them away? Could he fight against someone that powerful? The thought sent a wave of fear crashing over him. And yet, as he looked at them, he knew. He would die before he let anyone take them. This wasn't just about protecting them from a corrupt system. This was about keeping them safe from a man who wanted them gone. With determination burning in his chest, Thomas reached for his phone. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Diane, it's Thomas. We need to talk. It's about the girls." Because no one, not even a senator, was going to take them away from him. The unexpected call. A father's fear. Thomas sat in his patrol car long after Catherine Wells had left the cafe. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles turning white as his mind replayed her words. The twins' birth mother. Followed. Threatened. Running from a senator who wanted them erased. It didn't seem real. But it was. He glanced down at the newspaper article again. Senator James Caldwell. A man with decades of power, connections, and influence. A man who had built his career on manipulation and control. Hope and faith were never supposed to have survived. And now, their very existence was a threat to a man with everything to lose. Thomas let out a slow, controlled breath, forcing himself to think like a cop. One step at a time. Assess the situation. Identify the risks. Protect your own. And right now, the biggest risk was what Caldwell would do if he found out the twins were alive. A sharp knock on his window snapped him out of his thoughts. "Yo, Blake, you okay?" It was Officer Martinez, his partner on night shifts. He stood outside the patrol car, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee, his breath misting in the cold night air. Thomas took another deep breath before rolling down the window. "Yeah," he lied. "Just a lot on my mind." Martinez handed him the coffee, squinting at him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas almost laughed. A ghost would have been easier to deal with. Instead, he nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was scalding hot, but he barely noticed. "Martinez." He hesitated. "If you found out someone powerful was threatening your family, what would you do?" Martinez's expression darkened. "I wouldn't wait for them to make the first move." Thomas nodded slowly. That settled it. He needed a plan, the weight of a decision. By the time Thomas arrived home, it was nearly midnight. His apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the baby monitor. He stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching Hope and Faith as they slept. Their tiny chests rose and fell in peaceful rhythm, their faces relaxed, completely unaware of the storm brewing around them. Thomas felt his chest tighten. How could he even begin to tell them, when they were older, that the man who helped create them had tried to have them erased? He wouldn't, because he wasn't going to let that man have any control over their lives. He stepped closer to their cribs, resting a gentle hand on Hope's tiny back, feeling the steady warmth of her breathing. "I won't let him touch you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No matter what it takes." As he pulled his hand away, Faith let out a sleepy sigh, shifting slightly before settling again. His resolve hardened. First thing tomorrow, he was going to call Diane Lewis at Child Protective Services. He needed legal options, because if Senator Caldwell thought he could come for these girls, He was dead wrong. The meeting with CPS. The next morning, Thomas walked into the CPS office, his heart pounding in his chest. The building smelled of stale coffee and paperwork, the walls lined with posters about child safety and adoption resources. Diane Lewis met him at her office door, motioning him inside. "You sounded urgent on the phone," she said, closing the door behind them. Thomas wasted no time. He placed the newspaper article on her desk. She picked it up, scanning the headline. As she read, her expression shifted, from confusion to disbelief, and finally concern. When she looked up, her face was grave. "This is serious, Thomas. No kidding." She set the paper down, crossing her arms. "So you're telling me that Hope and Faith's birth mother was being hunted when she left them, and now she's afraid the senator will come after them again?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Thomas said, jaw tightening. Diane took a deep breath, her fingers tapping against the desk. "There's no official way to protect them unless he actually makes a move," she admitted. "Right now, all you have is their mother's word. If he hasn't threatened them directly, there's no legal standing to." Thomas slammed his fist on the desk. He already tried to erase them once. "You think he's just going to let them live now, that he's losing control?" Diane flinched but didn't look away. "Thomas," she said gently, "I believe you. But the law requires evidence. You know that." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "So what can I do?" Diane sighed. "If you want full legal protection, you need to finalize the adoption." Thomas froze. He had been fostering Hope and Faith for nearly a year now. He had never hesitated when it came to caring for them. But making it official, the weight of that decision pressed against his chest. "You've been their father in every way that matters," Diane said softly. "But right now, legally, you're just their guardian. If you adopt them, it gives you more power to protect them, to fight for them." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Adoption. A word that had once felt too big, too permanent, too terrifying. But now it felt like the only way forward. "What do I need to do?" he asked. Diane smiled. "I'll get the paperwork started. A target on their backs." That night, after tucking the twins into bed, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, staring at the adoption forms Diane had sent over. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the pen. Once he signed, there was no turning back. Not that he wanted to. He had fought for them every step of the way. Now it was time to make it official. With a deep breath, he signed his name at the bottom of the form. And at that moment, something inside him settled. They were his. Hope and Faith Blake. His daughters, his everything. But even as the relief washed over him, something in his gut told him this fight wasn't over. Because somewhere, in a mansion with too much power and not enough conscience, Senator James Caldwell was about to find out that the daughters he thought were gone forever were very much alive. And their father? He wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The fight for family. A shadow in the dark. The storm rolled in fast. Dark clouds churned in the sky over Blackwood, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed across the city like an omen. Thomas Blake stood on his apartment balcony, staring out over the rain-slicked streets, his mind racing. It had been 3 days since Catherine Wells had walked back into his life. 3 days since he learned the truth that Hope and Faith weren't just abandoned, but were nearly erased by a man who still had powerful friends and too many secrets to protect. And now his gut told him something was coming. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing in the shadows. His phone buzzed in his pocket, dragging him from his thoughts. Diane Lewis. His pulse quickened as he answered. "Blake," he said, stepping back inside. "Thomas, we have a problem." Diane's voice was tight, edged with something he hadn't heard before. Fear. His grip on the phone tightened. "What is it?" She hesitated, and that alone made his stomach twist. Diane was one of the calmest people he knew. If she was shaken, it meant things were bad. I was reviewing your adoption papers today. Everything was progressing normally, but a sharp breath. Someone's trying to block it. The air in Thomas's lungs turned to stone. Who? Another pause. The request was filed under an anonymous legal petition. But when I started digging, her voice lowered. Thomas, it's connected to Senator Caldwell's legal team. The room tilted. Caldwell had made his first move. I don't know how he found out, Diane continued. But someone must have tipped him off that Hope and Faith are alive. And now he's trying to stall the adoption, probably so he can file for custody himself. A cold fury settled into Thomas's chest. That bastard, he muttered. He thinks he can just walk in and take them. Legally, no, Diane said. But if he can drag this through court, make a case that he's their biological father, he could try to claim parental rights. Thomas gritted his teeth. Hope and Faith weren't some political pawn to be claimed when it was convenient. They were his daughters, and he wasn't going to let a monster get his hands on them. What do I do? He asked, his voice steel. Diane didn't hesitate. We fight back. The legal war begins. The next morning, Thomas walked into the law offices of Morrison and Tate, one of the best family law firms in the state. Waiting for him in a sleek, glass-walled office was Claire Morrison, the investigative journalist who had been digging into Caldwell for months. She stood as he entered, setting down a thick manila folder. I heard the senator is trying to push for custody, she said. I did some digging. Thomas sat down, exhaling sharply. What did you find? Claire slid the folder across the table, proof that Caldwell has done this before. Thomas's blood ran cold. What? Claire nodded grimly. There have been 2 other cases where young women, both of them connected to Caldwell, had children that mysteriously disappeared. One went into the foster system and was never found again. The other, she hesitated, was found dead. Official cause of death was ruled as complications from childbirth, but her medical records were sealed. Thomas felt sick. Caldwell hadn't just been trying to erase Hope and Faith. He'd been doing this for years, and now he was trying to finish the job. Why the hell isn't this public knowledge? Thomas demanded. Claire's jaw tightened. Because he's untouchable. His political machine buries everything. But I have enough evidence now. If we go public with this, we can destroy him. Thomas's mind raced. Destroying Caldwell meant exposing the truth, but it also meant drawing attention to Hope and Faith. And if Caldwell was desperate, if he knew he was about to lose everything, he might do something reckless, something dangerous. For the first time, Thomas wasn't sure if fighting back was the safest option. Claire must have seen the conflict in his eyes, because she leaned forward. If you go through with this, Thomas, there's no turning back. You need to be ready for a war. Thomas stared at the folder, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He thought about his daughters, the way Hope curled into his chest when she was sleepy, the way Faith giggled when he made silly faces. They had already been through hell before they even had a chance to live. He wasn't going to let Caldwell steal their future. I don't care how powerful he is, Thomas said, his voice ice cold. I'll bury him myself. A warning from the shadows. That night, Thomas drove home with his senses on high alert. The city lights flashed past him in a blur, but his mind was focused on one thing: protecting his girls. As he pulled into his apartment parking lot, he noticed something off. A black SUV was parked across the street. Engine running. Headlights off. A figure sat behind the wheel, watching. Thomas's gut twisted. He knew a surveillance op when he saw one. Instead of panicking, he reached for his gun, flicking the safety off as he stepped out of his car. The SUV's engine revved, and before Thomas could get close, it peeled away, tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. Thomas stood there, jaw clenched. They were watching him. Watching the girls. The war had already started, and now it was only a matter of time before Caldwell made his next move. A father's stand. Later that night, Thomas sat in the nursery, watching his daughters sleep peacefully, completely unaware of the danger closing in around them. His grip tightened on the adoption papers still in his hands. It didn't matter if Caldwell had money. It didn't matter if he had powerful friends. Thomas was their father now, and he wasn't going down without a fight. He leaned over, brushing a soft kiss against Hope's tiny forehead, then Faith's. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice full of quiet steel. He wouldn't let them be erased. Not by Caldwell. Not by anyone. This wasn't just about the law anymore. This was a father's war. And Thomas Blake wasn't going to lose. The final battle. The last warning. The morning air was crisp and still when Thomas woke up to the sound of his doorbell ringing. Not the soft, casual ring of a neighbor. Not the quick buzz of a delivery guy. This was deliberate. Slow. A statement. Thomas's instincts flared instantly. He carefully slid out of bed, moving with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years walking into potential danger. He reached for the gun in his nightstand. Habit now. Before checking the baby monitor. Hope and Faith were still asleep, curled in their blankets, their tiny chests rising and falling in peaceful innocence. Good. He tucked the gun at the back of his waistband and made his way to the front door. When he peeked through the peephole, his jaw tightened. A man in a dark suit stood on the other side, neatly pressed. Too clean, too confident. Not a cop. Not a normal visitor. Thomas unlocked the door, but didn't open it all the way. "Can I help you?" The man smiled. It was the kind of smile Thomas had seen 100 times in his years on the force, the kind that meant power, control, and a dangerous level of arrogance. "Officer Blake," the man said smoothly, "I represent Senator Caldwell's legal team. We need to talk." Thomas's blood boiled. He should have known Caldwell wouldn't come himself. Cowards like him never did their own dirty work. The man continued, "Senator Caldwell is a very powerful man. He has resources, influence." Thomas cut him off. "Get to the point." The man nodded, pulling out a sleek black envelope. "Consider this a friendly warning. If you don't back off. If you don't drop the adoption proceedings and walk away from the girls." His smile turned sharper. "There will be consequences." Thomas took the envelope, opened it. Inside was a printed legal motion. Caldwell was suing for parental rights. But underneath the legal jargon, Thomas saw something that made his stomach drop. A surveillance photo of him at the park with Hope and Faith. Someone had been watching them. Every muscle in Thomas's body locked up. He had dealt with criminals his whole life. He had faced men with guns, men with nothing to lose. But this was different. This was a threat to his family. His hands curled into fists. The man adjusted his tie, still unbothered. "Caldwell doesn't lose. And if you push him, you won't like what happens next." Thomas stepped forward, his voice deadly calm. "You think I scare easy." The man hesitated, clearly not expecting that reaction. Thomas leaned in closer, his words like cold steel. "Listen to me carefully," he said, voice quiet but lethal. "You go back to your boss and tell him this. I don't care who he is. I don't care how much money he has. He is never getting my daughters." His eyes burned with unshakable fury. If he wants a war, he just got one. He slammed the door in the man's face. The plan. Thomas didn't waste time. He called Claire Morrison, the journalist. "I'm ready. We take Caldwell down. Now." By that afternoon, she had assembled a team of lawyers and investigators, all of them ready to expose Caldwell's crimes. Thomas and Claire sat in a back office, poring over years of buried records. "What's our play?" Thomas asked, his hands clenched. Claire tapped the file. "We take everything to the press. Full exposure. Court documents, financial records, testimonies from the women he threatened." She pushed a folder toward him. "And we leak it before he can silence us." Thomas nodded. "Do it." Caldwell Strikes Back. 2 nights later, Thomas's phone rang at 2 a.m. It wasn't Diane. Wasn't Claire. It was Mrs. Grayson. Her voice was panicked, shaking. "Thomas, there was a break-in. Your apartment." His heart stopped. He was out of bed in seconds, throwing on clothes, racing toward his car. When he pulled up outside his building, his worst fear was confirmed. The front door was wide open. The nursery was ransacked. And on the crib, a note. "Drop the case, Officer Blake, or next time, we take them." The final confrontation. That was it. No more warnings, no more legal battles. Caldwell had made this personal. And now, Thomas was going to end it. Claire had set up a press conference, one that would broadcast across every news station. At exactly 10 a.m., Thomas stood behind the podium, flanked by lawyers, investigators, and journalists. He took a deep breath. And then, he told the world everything. The truth about Catherine. The truth about the twins. The truth about Caldwell's pattern of threats, disappearances, and buried crimes. He held up the note from the break-in. "He tried to erase them once," Thomas said, his voice full of quiet rage. "Now he wants to claim them for himself." Not happening. The cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. And then, it happened. Breaking news scrolled across every screen. Senator Caldwell under federal investigation. Claire handed him her phone. "They're raiding his house right now." It was over. Caldwell had lost. A father's victory. 3 weeks later, Thomas sat in the courtroom. Across from him, a defeated Caldwell. His once polished suit was wrinkled, his face pale. The judge adjusted her glasses. "The court has reviewed all evidence, and in light of recent charges against Mr. Caldwell." She turned to Thomas. "The adoption of hope and faith is officially approved." For a moment, Thomas couldn't breathe. Then, relief crashed over him. Hope and faith were his, forever. As he left the courthouse, the girls in his arms, Mrs. Grayson wiped at her teary eyes. "You did it," she whispered. Thomas looked down at the 2 little lives he had fought for. His daughters. His family. "Yeah," he murmured, smiling. "We did." Epilogue. 18 years later. The living room was filled with balloons and laughter. Thomas, now older, with silver streaks in his hair, stood watching his daughters, Hope and Faith, now grown women, as they celebrated their 18th birthday. Faith nudged her sister. "You giving your speech or what?" Hope rolled her eyes, but smiled at Thomas before standing. She cleared her throat. "Dad, you always said we were fighters," she began, her voice strong. "And maybe that's true." She looked at Faith, then back at him. "But the real fighter was you." A lump formed in Thomas's throat. Hope stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. "Thank you for fighting for us, Dad." Faith joined the hug. And as Thomas held his daughters close, feeling their warmth, their strength, their love, he knew he would do it all again. Because they weren't just his daughters. They were his everything. And nothing, not even a senator, had been strong enough to take that away. The final battle. The fall of a monster. Senator James Caldwell sat at the defense table, his once flawless suit wrinkled, his face ashen as the prosecution laid out the evidence against him. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, cameras, and a quiet murmur of anticipation. Across the aisle, Thomas Blake sat, his hands clasped together, flanked by Diane Lewis and Claire Morrison. His heart pounded, but his expression was stone. For over a year, Caldwell had tried to bury his crimes, his past, his failures. Now, he was the one being buried. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Eva Hernandez, paced in front of the jury. "This man," she said, pointing directly at Caldwell, "has used his power, his wealth, and his influence to cover up crimes, intimidate witnesses, and destroy lives. But no more. She turned, scanning the jury. We have seen the documents, the threats, the financial transactions linked to silent settlements, and worst of all, the testimonies of the women he tried to erase, including Catherine Wells. The courtroom stilled as Catherine stood from her seat. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. I was 19, she said, pregnant with twins, and Senator Caldwell made it clear he would never let those babies exist. Caldwell shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Catherine's voice rose. So I ran. I hid. I tried to do what was best for my daughters. And when I couldn't go back for them, Thomas Blake found them. She looked at Thomas, and for the first time, tears welled in her eyes. He saved them when I couldn't. Thomas's chest tightened. Eva Hernandez turned back to the jury. The prosecution rests, she said firmly. The judge looked at Caldwell's defense attorney. Does the defense wish to respond? Caldwell's lawyer, a man who had once been cocky and arrogant, stood slowly, glancing at his client before shaking his head. No, Your Honor. He knew. The battle was over. The judge nodded, her gavel hitting the desk. Very well. Given the overwhelming evidence, the court finds James Caldwell guilty on all counts, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and child endangerment. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Then, the explosion of cameras flashing, voices rising, reporters scrambling to capture the downfall of a powerful man. But Thomas barely heard them. Because at that moment, as Caldwell was led away in handcuffs, hope and faith ran toward him, and everything else disappeared. The moment of truth. 3 weeks later, Thomas Blake stood in front of a different judge. This courtroom was smaller, quieter, but his heart pounded even harder than it had during Caldwell's trial. Because today was the day he would become Hope and Faith's father, officially, permanently, forever. Diane stood beside him, offering a reassuring nod. Mrs. Grayson sat in the front row, tears in her eyes. Hope and Faith sat on either side of him, their little hands clasped in his. The judge adjusted her glasses. Officer Blake, she said, flipping through the documents. You have served as guardian and caretaker for these children for over a year now. Are you fully prepared to adopt them as your own? Thomas exhaled slowly. I've been prepared since the night I found them, he said, his voice steady. The judge smiled. Then let's make it official. She stamped the documents. With the full authority of the court, I hereby grant legal adoption of Hope and Faith Blake to Thomas Blake. Applause erupted from Diane, from Mrs. Grayson, from Claire Morrison, and the legal team who had fought alongside them. But all Thomas could focus on was his daughters. Hope smiled up at him, her eyes full of trust. Faith, never one to hold back, launched herself at him, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. Thomas closed his eyes, holding them both. His daughters, his forever. 18 years later, the graduation ceremony was in full swing, the school's football field packed with students in blue and gold caps and gowns. Thomas sat in the front row, his police uniform freshly pressed, Mrs. Grayson beside him. At the podium, the valedictorian stepped forward. Hope Blake. She cleared her throat, adjusting her cap, scanning the crowd until she found him. I was abandoned as a baby, she began. I don't remember it, but I've heard the story 100 times. How I was left out in the cold. How my twin sister and I had no one. She took a breath. And then we did. Her eyes locked onto her father. A police officer found us. A man who could have walked away, but didn't. A man who fought for us, protected us, raised us. Her voice softened. A man who taught me what it means to be loved. Thomas swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. Hope lifted her chin, smiling. So today, as I graduate and prepare to start the next chapter of my life, I just want to say. She took off her cap, holding it over her heart. Thank you, Dad. Faith, sitting with the other graduates, cupped her hands around her mouth and whooped loudly. The crowd cheered. And Thomas? He laughed, shaking his head, wiping at his eyes as he stood and clapped harder than anyone else. A father's love. That night, after the celebration had ended and the guests had gone, Thomas sat on his porch, staring up at the stars. Footsteps approached, and he looked up to see Faith. She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You okay, old man?" she teased. Thomas chuckled. "Yeah, just thinking." Faith sighed, tilting her head back. "It's crazy, huh? How much has changed?" Thomas nodded. "Yeah, but one thing never did." Faith turned to him, curious. "What's that?" He looked at her, his daughter. "You and Hope were always mine, long before the paperwork, long before the judge. The moment I found you, I knew." Faith's smile wobbled, her eyes shining. "Love you, Dad," she whispered. He kissed her forehead. "Love you more, kid." Just then, Hope appeared at the door. "Okay, enough mushy stuff. Movie night." Faith groaned. "If it's another legal drama, I swear." Hope smirked. "What? I'm going to law school. Get used to it." Thomas laughed, pushing himself up from the chair. As he followed his daughters inside, he realized something. All the pain, all the battles, all the fears he had faced over the years, they were worth it. Because in the end, he had won the greatest fight of all. He had built a family, and nothing in the world could ever take that away.